If you're a fan of this channel, you're probably at least familiar with Infamous, Suckerpunch Productions' second major franchise under Sony that ran from early 2009 all the way through to mid-2014, and is one of the torchbearers of the tragically underrepresented genre of superhero sandbox. Tragically underrepresented mostly because it's one of my favorite genres. I like the concept of the sandbox game, but I really don't like how many of them are so interchangeable these days. Infamous is a great series, with Infamous 2 in particular probably being part of my top 5 favorite games of all time. Any game that can make me genuinely misty-eyed is something special. But let's not discount the first Infamous game either. Despite the choppiness, being rough around the edges due to the fact that it was an early PS3 game, and Cole McGrath not being able to emote his way out of a paper bag due to his voice actor sounding like he gargles gravel, Infamous 1 is great in its own right. With fast-paced gameplay, satisfying ever-evolving combat, a great free range of movement, and a sense of anarchic chaos worthy of Sid Vicious. But there's something about this game that never sat right with me, which is just how inconclusive it is. Because by and large, the game has a really intriguing story with a mindfuck ending that makes you reconsider the entire game. That said, by the time you beat Infamous, the main two plot threads are tied up, spoilers ahead, the race sphere is destroyed and Kessler is defeated, but that's only 2 of several plot threads. The rest don't actually get a resolution. The biggest of which being Moya. You find out that she was lying to Cole the whole game, then she says she's gonna escalate the situation because you stopped cooperating, but then she's never seen or heard from again. Or the severed relationship between Cole and Zeke. Cole is still rightfully bitter about Zeke getting Trish killed, and beyond Zeke sort of saving Cole in the final boss, they've done nothing to mend their friendship. The government cover-up of the Empire City quarantine also hasn't wrapped up, with national newscasts still presenting fake news about the situation even after the end credits. Then there's the secondary villains. Sasha, the leader of the Reapers, and Alden, the leader of the Dustmen. Sasha gets captured by the First Sons and is never seen again, and Alden jumps off a bridge and is never seen again. All of this bugged me for a really long time. Like, what gives? Why was so much of Infamous left without a resolution? I wondered this for a number of years, until in 2016 I discovered the answer. That being, the brief Infamous comic book series by DC Comics that ran from March to August of 2011. Seeing as it ran concurrently with the launch of Infamous 2 in June 2011, this was probably intended as a tie-in to the game in order to bridge the gap and answer any questions that anyone had regarding the story of Infamous 1. You know, to anybody who gave a damn. As a matter of fact, recently I was dwelling on this comic series and an errant thought popped into my head that I just wasn't able to shake. Could the 6-issue comic series have actually been the original direction or a scrapped concept for Infamous 2? Think about it. Why would they have left so much of the first game incomplete only to complete it in a piece of media that's not even part of the core medium that the series was made in? Like, why leave a video game story to be concluded in comic book form unless something else is at play? Perhaps they left aspects of the story incomplete deliberately in order to tie them all up in a sequel. It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened. But then sometime early into development, they decided on a different direction for Infamous 2 and so had to make the comic series as sort of a make-good for not following up on their original intended direction. Because for as great as Infamous 2 is, it goes in a completely different direction that you would expect given the ending to Infamous 1. In fact, very little of the first Infamous game is even relevant to the second game. It's subversive in a really good way, but it's stuff like this that really gets myself thinking. So if this comic book series endeavors to tie up all the loose ends from the first game as well as tell a story in its own right, let's take a look at it with a critical eye and with that big question in mind. Could this have theoretically been Infamous 2 at some point? I should mention that there's going to be a lot of stuff here that probably won't make sense to you unless you've played the first Infamous game or at least seen a story summary. I'm going to be moving forward with the understanding that you already know what happens, so I can brush past some of the details. These comics were written by William Harms, who's also credited as the lead writer to Infamous 1 as well as co-writer of Infamous 2. So at least we know there's an element of the author's vision in this series. The art, on the other hand, is done by Eric Nagayan, I think that's how that's pronounced, and his art is certainly better than anything I could ever do, but it does kinda look wonky at times. In particular, he has trouble with eyes, but there's some striking visuals, and I appreciate that there's never any wasted space in his panels. In some of the more outlaw comics out there, you tend to see a bit of skimping on some of the finer points like background details in order for them to save time, but I'd imagine DC is above that even in their more minor comic series, so there's no compromises here. As far as the structure goes, these comics jump around on the timeline a bit in order to fill in continuity gaps. Some of it's relevant to the story at hand, while some of it's just fluff. like the second scene of the first issue taking place right before the intro to the first game. Once you get into it, the relevant plot has several parts moving in tandem. The Empire City quarantine has been going on for just shy of a month, and it's now reached the point where supplies have all but run dry, and there's no government assistance on the way. So those who haven't died are either starving or dying of illness. Perhaps even the plague in some cases? Question mark. It's hell on earth, but the government is still covering up for the Empire City disaster, and outwardly they're downplaying or outright denying the conditions that the Empire City residents have been forced to live in, while refusing anybody direct access to the city, so an investigative reporter risks her life to try and expose the truth. Meanwhile, the city is still in anarchy as the First Sons are running rampant after the death of Kessler, so Cole along with Warden Harms are attempting to push them back to their last stronghold, Pier 12. Then there's Moya. Moya's part of the story is a bit complicated. It's revealed that she was secretly working with the First Sons in order to create the Ray Sphere, and during this story, she's the primary antagonist whose goals are twofold. Capture Cole alive so they can use him as a weapon and also use him to create more like him, and also keep the Empire City quarantine under control until she can do so. And she needs to act quickly because, to paraphrase her, Cole is a bit of a hot commodity among the various branches of the government because conduits could be the next major advancement needed in any number of government sectors. So Cole theoretically has a pretty interesting life ahead of him, and Moya is at the front of the line to use him. To capture Cole, Moya has a private military at her disposal, which rolls in to fill in the vacuum left behind after the First Sons are defeated. However, she's also established to be working without the knowledge of her superiors, so her ass is on the line if she doesn't keep things under control, leading to a lot of desperate tactical moves. However, because her goal is to take Cole alive, she also has to protect him from the final piece of the puzzle, Dave Warner. He was a heavily indebted man who volunteered to be a test subject for the Ray Sphere in exchange for Kessler paying off his debt. He was then exposed to ray field radiation over 30 times, gradually transforming him into a more and more powerful conduit. However, Kessler never held up his end of the bargain, and David's wife committed suicide out of desperation, with their daughter implied to have starved to death. So now David is out for revenge against Kessler. Of course, Kessler is dead, but as the final twist of the game told us, Kessler is the future version of Cole, and Dave has become completely unhinged from his powers. And one of his powers is the ability to see people on a genetic level, so he sees no difference between Cole and Kessler, meaning that Cole, on top of everything, is being hunted by the world's most powerful living conduit. So yeah, a lot of moving pieces, but seeing as this is a wholly story-based medium that's building off a story that was already in progress, it works quite well. It doesn't have to waste time on establishing character motivation, for example. Much like this video, it's working on the assumption that you're already a fan and already know what's going on, which is definitely to the comic's benefit. Of course, this being an in-between quill, it needs to return to status quo by the end, but as long as they're able to do so and don't contradict anything that's happened or will happen, they can indulge in whatever wild and wacky ideas they have. Like the Chekhov's gun of Moya's secret conduit cloning project, so they're able to take advantage of the inconsequentiality of the story for positive effect. Although one questionable thing is that they established that the Ray Sphere was used on other people before Cole. Part of Cole's arc in the second game is realizing that because he was the first person to use the Ray Sphere, the ray field radiation that was causing the plague was caused by him, meaning that he was directly responsible for the potential apocalypse that was happening. So that's nullified a bit with the knowledge that ray field radiation was around before Cole used the Ray Sphere. Even still, another thing this comic series does really well is bring across a lot of things that wouldn't have translated very well into a game. Like, for example, the emotional toll that this entire experience has taken on Cole. The game is at heart a power fantasy, so it'd be really hard to present Cole as vulnerable in any way without it coming across as disingenuous. Because in games, progress is made by succeeding, and it's hard to make somebody who's always succeeding look weak. But here, they really made it a point to show Cole in a very sympathetic and vulnerable position. He's lost the love of his life due to the actions of his best friend, he's having to deal with the incredible burden that Kessler has left him with, as well as having to cope with the absolute mindfuck of what Kessler revealed to him. On top of that, he's being relied upon in order to keep Empire City from falling apart totally while he's being hunted by basically everything. It's clearly established to be too much for him to handle. He says as much to Zeke during their first real conversation post-Kessler. Cole can't eat, he can't sleep, he can't think straight, he is an absolute hot mess. He feels like he's lost everything except for Zeke, and even Zeke is debatable given everything that he's caused. It's only through sheer force of will and stubbornness that Cole doesn't collapse where he stands. It's even implied that his aggression towards the First Sons is just as much about emotional catharsis as it is about saving the city, which explains why he's so insistent on being the only dog in the fight. The story of the world weighing on Cole comes to a head at the end of the 3rd issue, where he has a full-blown meltdown in Zeke's apartment. It's really powerful stuff. And Moya uses this vulnerability to her advantage with the help of Sasha's powers of hallucination. She uses his guilt to finally be able to capture and interrogate Cole. Transferring the medium from video game into comic form also helps the plot point of the quarantine itself, because making the quarantine fully fleshed out was a bit difficult in the game on account of the fact that you're seeing the entire story through Cole's perspective. So you're not really seeing the perspective of the average person struggling to survive and how hard it is for them. You see dead people littering the streets, but that's not really something the average person will pay any mind to because you don't have any emotional investment in some random NPC laying on the ground, so it doesn't have the same impact as actually having the spotlight be put on how desolate Empire City is, and how the people who are struggling to survive are barely scraping by to the absolute indifference of the military and the government at large. To that point, it's also a benefit that they're able to switch perspectives very easily. In the game, you kinda relied on audio logs to fill in the exposition gaps because you can't naturally switch to a different character's perspective in a game. To do so, it would either be an extended unplayable cutscene, or you'd need to design an entirely separate non-powered character like the Mary Jane sections in Spider-Man 2018. And I don't think there's a single person in existence who enjoys those. But you're able to naturally shift from perspective to perspective in order to tell the story in a much more complete way here. So you can jump from David's perspective to Cole's perspective to Moya's perspective to a flashback all the way back again. So they really do take advantage of the different mediums. Although there are some things that didn't work so well in translation, like how they suddenly and jarringly establish Cole as somebody who's run from every challenge in his life. All to motivate him to finally face David in a "I'm not running anymore" kind of way. But that's something that was never brought up to my knowledge, especially in the game, because gameplay needs to happen, so you couldn't really run away from adversity. If anything, I remember him being the one to actively look for fights, so that's one way the translation of mediums hinders the story slightly. At its heart, this entire comic series is about what Cole does now that Kessler has changed everything. Of course, we're hardwired to hate Kessler because we never saw the human side of him, we only saw the tyrant bastard until his final moments where he laid it all bare. But here, they go a ways to flesh him out posthumously, like he's an evil bastard who's tortured people, but Zeke recounts a story of when he was captured by the First Sons, and Kessler would stumble into his cell, drunk off his ass, to try and talk to Zeke, only to stop himself over and over. So they really show us that the old Kessler, Cole, was trying to break through. He wanted things to go back to the way they were when he was in his youth, but he couldn't take his eyes off the prize for even a second, showing us a side of Kessler that we never really saw in the game. He's completely off his rocker and will take advantage of whoever he needs to, but in his own twisted perspective, he's doing it for what he sees as the right reasons. As for the plot threads that were left unresolved at the end of the game, Alden meets his end when Moya has her crew operate on him while he's still awake. Sasha escapes into the night, so nothing is definitive about her, but her story does meet an open-ended resolution. Zeke and Cole eventually do come to an understanding as well. They're not necessarily as close as they were before Zeke messed up, but they're at least on speaking terms, which is in keeping in line with their mutual arcs in Infamous 2, because there's a lingering tension between them that makes it clear that Cole hasn't fully forgiven Zeke. But Zeke is able to prove that he's better than the sins of his past, and Cole is able to, if not forgive him, at least tolerate him. The investigative journalist is eventually able to get into the city and run a story exposing the truth of how the residents of Empire City have been made to live, forcing the government's hand, just in time for the entire city to get friggin' nuked. Then there was even a question that was answered that I never even thought of: why Moya was so intent on tracking down John White. As it turns out, Kessler handed the Ray Sphere over to John knowingly, and with him being NSA and her being DARPA, if it got out to the other branches of the government that Moya was secretly working with the First Sons, it would be her ass on the cutting board, so she needed to bring him in. It's really interesting seeing just how deep the rabbit hole goes for her. And as for Moya herself, well, she meets the ending that she deserves. The Empire City Police Squad infiltrates the aircraft carrier she's on, the USS George Washington. Meanwhile, David Warner also shows up just in time for Sasha to free Cole. And Moya goes nuts, shoots a few military personnel, and unleashes the aforementioned genetically engineered conduits. The pier turns into an absolute war zone, and the USS George Washington gets demolished. Moya ends up being dragged down with the ship and drowning, and that's the last we ever see of her. Good f***ing riddance. Now, my explanation of this comic series might make the story seem more robust than it actually is, but while they fit a lot in, it's actually a really breezy read, with each entry only having 20 to 25 pages. You could jam through this in a dedicated half hour, so it's definitely worth checking out. I think it's actually a really great tale that bridges the gap between the first and second games, while also tying up all the loose ends left over. But it irritates me because I really don't think it should have been necessary. They shouldn't have left the story unfinished to begin with. But let's circle back to my initial hypothesis. Could this have been the original direction for the sequel? Because when you examine all the individual elements of the comic series, you can kind of see where some of the gameplay elements might have come out. Having to push the First Sons back to Pier 12, as well as push the military back to the USS George Washington and take them both out could have resulted in sort of a frontline territory control gameplay mechanic similar to Just Cause 4, where you need to take control of different parts of the map before you can do story missions and some such. The fact that the Reapers were regrouping before Moya took them out, that could have been the game's moral choice mechanic, where you take over territory either with the police or Sasha's forces. This was kind of already a thing in the first game, where good side missions were with the police and evil side missions were sometimes with the Reapers. You could have had this play a more central role in the game's progression, similar to how you had Nyx and Quo in the second game alter the story based on who you chose to work with. In fact, that idea in Infamous 2 might have stemmed from this hypothetical scrapped concept. The same goes for the genetically engineered conduits that Moya's scientists created, because genetically engineered conduits was also a plot point in Infamous 2. You know, Bertrand trying to start a new type of warfare. So once again, did that idea stem from this, and could the clones have been a faction of standard enemies, or a couple of boss fights in this hypothetical scrapped concept? The longevity of the quarantine could have resulted in rolling blackouts, which could justify doing the substation missions in order to get the power back on, and also get some more powers like in the first game. And then there's David, who could have played the same role as Nemesis in Resident Evil 3, this impossibly powerful enemy that you have to fight every now and again, but you can never take down fully. There's plenty of gunfights and plenty of different missions you can do with the First Sons and the military fighting against your forces, and you could probably even make an entire series of missions based around the investigative reporter trying to expose what's really going on. There's a lot of ideas here for how this could have been made into a game. Too many for me to honestly not believe that this wasn't at least a pitched concept for the sequel, and when you take into account that Infamous 1 left so many things open that didn't end up being relevant to Infamous 2, it almost makes too much sense. Now, let's just say hypothetically, and I swear take a shot for every time I've said hypothetically in this video, that this was the direction they took for the sequel. You play in roughly the same sandbox, and the missions and plot progression are based around this story. You have Moya and her forces as the main antagonistic force, and David as sort of a wild card. If this was the Infamous 2 we got, I think it would suck meaty bung, honestly. It has all the markings of a game that would have been nothing more than a wheel-spinning sequel, because how much of this would have just been blatantly recycling ideas and concepts that were already present in the first game, but without the innate freshness that came with it. So no, I don't think this would have worked as a full-on sequel, but I actually think this would have worked as sort of a standalone expansion or a side game to tide people over while they made the real Infamous 2 that we got. Because Infamous 2 got Festival of Blood, Infamous Second Son got First Light, so why couldn't we have had a standalone partial sequel to the first game as well? For some reason, my mind is fixated on Infamous Burning Sun, or Infamous Sins of the Future being the title of this game. If you have a better suggestion, let me know in the comment section. But then again, this was back in the late 2000s when the universal standards for post-launch content was a lot higher. This was the era where people got genuinely mad that Capcom made a DLC prologue and epilogue for Dead Rising 2, which was actual substantial DLC for a good price. But then again, the DLC was also Xbox exclusive, so that might have been the real culprit for the outrage. But either way, the point still stands. People weren't exactly okay with lore necessary content not being included in the base game at the time. So all things being equal, if they had to sleep in the bed they made for themselves, then this was probably the best way they could have done an Infamous 1.5 type thing without making something that could have potentially damaged the brand. No, this was something that history will look back on as being inoffensive at worst and a neat little way to tie up all the loose ends at best. Whether or not they should have left the story to Infamous 1 as it was doesn't really matter. All that matters is that it was, and how it ended up. And for those who cared enough to look into it, and for those who were aware of it, these comics do a good job at what they set out to do. So I can't in good conscience be mad about the Infamous comics, but it does make me wonder, what if? Of course, if they ever do decide to remake or remaster the first Infamous game, which I totally think they should given that it's really showing its age these days, I think it would be really cool for them to make this into a proper semi-sequel. Give us the Infamous sequel that we never got. Speaking of got, that's all I got, so if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing as well as hitting that bell so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Please, I really don't like speaking into the void. Otherwise, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace.